The note was not meant for him, and yet from the moment Dexter Mercer unfolded that small square of paper tucked inside the worn leather cover of a Bible at Houston's trading post, he knew his life would never be the same again. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Kansas prairie had turned the color of old copper pennies. Dexter had ridden into the small settlement of Caldwell on the southern edge of the territory after 6 weeks of cattle driving along the Kishom Trail, his boots caked with red dust and his spirit worn thin as a piece of saddle leather left out in the rain. He was 26 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes the color of creek water after a storm and a jaw that had not seen a razor in going on 2 weeks. He was not the kind of man who stopped to read things that were not his business. He was not the kind of man who felt much of anything after years of trailing cattle and sleeping under open skies, or so he had believed. Houston's trading post sat on the edge of the main road like a weathered old man who had given up trying to look presentable. It smelled of tobacco and tallow candles and the sweet rot of dried apples in barrels near the back wall. Dexter had come inside for a new pair of work gloves and maybe a tin of coffee, nothing more. He found the gloves hanging from a peg near the door. He found the coffee on the third shelf. And he found the Bible sitting face up on the counter beside a stack of old newspapers, left behind by someone passing through, or so old Hiram Houston explained when Dexter pointed to it. "Someone left it this morning," Hiram said, rubbing a spot off the counter with a dirty cloth. Lady came through, bought some salt pork and a length of ribbon, then headed out toward the Cimarron. "Forgot the book, I reckon." Dexter would have left it alone entirely, if not for the fact that the front cover was hanging open, and a small folded square of paper had slipped halfway out of the pages, and his elbow knocked it clean off the counter when he turned to pay. He bent to pick it up, and the note unfolded in his hand as though it had been waiting for him. The handwriting was neat and careful, the kind of handwriting that told you the woman who wrote it had been taught properly and took pride in it. The ink was dark, still sharp against the pale paper, which meant it had not been sitting inside that Bible for very long. It read, "My name is Jane Ford. I am 23 years of age and I am traveling alone across the Cimarron Strip toward the Oklahoma Territory. I have left a bad situation in Wichita and I am heading to my cousin's homestead near a place called Red Creek. If you are reading this, I ask only that you pray for my safe arrival. I have with me one horse, a gray mare named Pearl, a carpetbag with my belongings and enough provisions for 4 days. I am not in distress. I only wanted someone to know I existed in case no one ever finds out what became of me. Jane Ford." Dexter stood very still for a long moment. He read it a second time, then a third. The post outside was just now coming to life with the sounds of the midday trade, a wagon pulling up, a dog barking at something across the road, a pair of men arguing about the price of hides. The whole ordinary world continued exactly as it had been, and Dexter Mercer stood in the middle of it holding a note from a woman who had written it because she was afraid no one would remember her if something went wrong. He set the note on the counter very carefully, like it was something fragile. He picked it back up. "You said she went toward the Cimarron?" he asked Hiram. The old man looked up from his ledger. "That is what I said. Why?" Dexter folded the note and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, right over his heart, though he did not think about why he put it there rather than anywhere else. How long ago did she leave? 2 hours, maybe 2.5, not long after sunup. Dexter looked out the open doorway at the pale sky and the long flat stretch of prairie beyond the last row of buildings. The Cimarron was better than 20 miles south. The strip between Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory was rough country, dry and wide open, and in the autumn there were always bands of desperate men moving through it because the law on both sides was thin, and the land itself belonged to nobody in a legal sense, though many people believed otherwise, and some of them were willing to enforce their belief with violence. A woman alone on a gray horse with 4 days of provisions. He was back in the saddle within 7 minutes. his new gloves on his hands and his tin of coffee tucked in his saddlebag. His horse, a big chestnut gelding named Comet, shook his head as though he understood something was different about this particular ride. "I know," Dexter said to him, settling into the saddle and turning south. "I know." He rode at an easy lope for the first few miles, not wanting to burn Comet out before the day had properly started. The land opened up around him the way Kansas always did, like a great flat hand pressing down on the sky, the grass rolling in long pale waves under the steady wind that came out of the northwest. There were no trees to speak of, just the occasional line of cottonwoods marking where a creek ran, and the distant blue suggestion of hills far to the west that never seemed to get any closer no matter how long you rode toward them. He tried to think practically about what he was doing. He was a cowboy with no particular place to be until spring, when Ike Holt's outfit would be hiring again for the next drive. He had a little money saved, enough to last a few months if he was careful. He was a good tracker, not the best in the territory but good enough, and reading the trail left by a single horse on dry prairie would not be difficult. He was also chasing a woman he had never met based on a note she had not intended for him to read. He was aware that this was perhaps not the most sensible thing he had ever done. He had done plenty of sensible things in his life, and most of them had not amounted to much. He kept riding. By mid-morning he found the first sign of her. The hoofprints of a smaller horse, unshod on the right front, pressed into a patch of soft ground near a dry creek bed. She had stopped here briefly, possibly to let the horse drink from the thin trickle that still ran in the bottom of the wash. Beside the hoofprints there were the small depressions of boot heels, and they were narrow, pointing toward the south and west. She was heading roughly for the Cimarron, just as Hiram had said. Dexter crouched beside the tracks and looked at them for a moment, then stood and scanned the horizon in the direction she had gone. The prairie was empty in every direction, just grass and sky and the sound of the wind. But the emptiness of it, which had never bothered him before, suddenly felt different. It felt like something was missing from it, something that ought to be there. He remounted and followed. Around noon he stopped to water Comet at a stock pond he knew from previous drives. While the horse drank, Dexter ate some jerked beef and a piece of hard corn bread from his saddlebag, and he took out the note and read it again. He was not sure what he expected to find in it that he had not found before. The words were the same. "My name is Jane Ford. I am 23 years of age. I am not in distress. I only wanted someone to know I existed." That last line was the one that had done something to him. Not the part about being in distress or the part about her traveling alone, though both of those things concerned him on a purely practical level. It was that one quiet admission at the end. "I only wanted someone to know I existed." He could not say exactly why that line cut through him the way it did. He had been riding through this country for years, and he had met all manner of people and heard all manner of hard stories, and he was not a particularly sentimental man. But something about the honesty of that sentence, the way it had been written without any plea or dramatic flourish, just a plain statement of a plain human fear, had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter he could not quite reach. He put the note away and called to Comet, and they rode on. It was late in the afternoon, with the sun dropping fast and the light going gold and then amber across the grass, when he spotted her. She was perhaps half a mile ahead of him, a small figure on a gray horse moving steadily southwest. Even at that distance, he could see the set of her shoulders, straight and determined in a way that told him she was not stopping until she had to. The gray horse was moving at a walk, and occasionally the figure would raise one hand to shade her eyes, looking out ahead, as though she was searching for something on the horizon. Dexter pulled Comet down to a walk himself. He was aware, quite suddenly and with a particular clarity, that he needed to think about how he was going to approach this. A woman alone on the prairie who heard hoofbeats coming up behind her fast was going to react the same way any sensible person would. She was going to be afraid, and she was going to be right to be afraid. because the Cimarron Strip in 1873 was not a place where lone riders approaching you from behind generally meant good news. He slowed further, giving her time to notice him on her own terms rather than riding up on her suddenly. He stayed to the side so she could see him clearly if she looked back, and he made no fast movements. He was still a couple 100 yards behind her when the gray horse turned its head, and the woman on its back turned as well. Even from that distance he could see the stiffening of her posture. She reined the gray around to face him, one hand dropping to something at her hip. He raised both his hands at once, showing his palms, and slowed Comet to a gentle walk, approaching slowly and directly, so there was nothing sneaking or indirect about his approach. "I'm not here to cause you trouble," he called when he was close enough for the words to carry without him having to shout them. "I promise you that." She did not move. She was watching him with an expression he could not fully read yet, but it contained wariness and something sharper than wariness, something that told him she had been through enough to have learned not to take promises from strangers at face value. As he rode closer, he could see her properly for the first time. Jane Ford was not a small woman in the way that some men thought all women ought to be. She was medium height in the saddle, with dark reddish-brown hair that had partly come loose from its pins and was blowing across her face in the wind. Her eyes were green, a very clear, direct green, and they were fixed on him with an attention that made him feel as though she was taking careful inventory of everything about him. She wore a dark blue dress that had seen better days and a tan canvas riding coat over it, and she had a small revolver holstered at her hip, which she had not drawn but which her hand was resting near. "Then state your business," she said. Her voice was steady, which impressed him. "And state it plain." He stopped Comet about 10 feet from her, close enough to talk but far enough that she would not feel crowded. He reached slowly into his shirt pocket and drew out the folded note and held it up between 2 fingers. She went very still. The color that came into her face was not embarrassment exactly. It was something more complex than that. It was the expression of a person who had done something private and vulnerable and had just discovered it was no longer private. "I found it at the trading post," he said. "Hiram said you forgot the Bible when you left. The note slipped out." She stared at the piece of paper for a long moment without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "You read it?" "Yes." She looked at him, and he waited, because he had a sense that the next thing she said was going to matter a great deal. "Why did you follow me?" she asked. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. He thought about how to say it honestly without sounding like a fool or, worse, like a threat. "Because you wrote that you wanted someone to know you existed," he said. "And it seemed to me that knowing you existed and then turning around and going the other direction would be a poor way to honor that." The expression on her face shifted. It was only a small shift, the kind that a person's face makes when something unexpected happens to the interior landscape of them, when something they had been braced against turns out not to be the shape they expected. She did not smile, not yet, but something in the set of her jaw eased. "That is either the most decent thing I have heard in some time," she said carefully, "or it is a very clever thing to say to a woman alone on the prairie." "I cannot make you believe which one it is," he said. "That is your call to make. My name is Dexter Mercer. I have been working cattle drives out of Wichita for the past 4 years. I am not a dangerous man, but I understand that you have no particular reason to take my word for that." She studied him for another long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them. The gray mare nickered softly and Comet flicked an ear. "Jane Ford," she said at last, which he already knew, but he understood she was introducing herself properly and he treated it as such. "Miss Ford," he said with a small nod. "It is not Miss," she said. "It was Mrs. once. It is not anything anymore." She said it with the flat, even tone of someone who had practiced not feeling that particular sentence. "I should ask you to give me back my note and ride along." "You should," he agreed. "You would be perfectly within your rights." She looked at him. But you are still 2 days of riding from the Cimarron, and probably another half day or more to Red Creek after that. The Strip is not a good place to travel alone. There are men through there who are not particular about whose property they help themselves to, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word property." He paused. "I am not saying you cannot handle yourself. The fact that you got this far tells me you likely can. I am saying that two people are safer than one, and I have no fixed destination and no particular reason not to ride in this direction." "You are offering to ride with me," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am offering to be company if you want it and to mind my own business if you do not." The sun was getting low behind him. He could see it in the way it lit the side of her face, turning the loose strands of her hair to copper. She looked out to the southwest for a moment, as though consulting the open prairie about whether this was a reasonable thing to do, and the prairie being the prairie gave her no useful answer. "We ought to make camp before full dark," she said at last. "There is a draw with cottonwoods about 2 miles on. I spotted it before you caught up to me." It was not exactly yes and not exactly no. It was something better, because it was practical and it was real, and it meant she was choosing to let him stay in her orbit rather than pushing him away. "I saw it too," he said. "Good spot." They rode side by side after that, not speaking much, but the silence between them was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that two people fall into when they are in the process of quietly taking each other's measure, and when neither of them finds anything in the measuring that alarms them. The cottonwoods at the draw were small and bent sideways from years of wind, but they offered enough cover to make a reasonable camp. There was a thin creek running through the bottom of the draw, enough to water the horses and fill the canteens. Dexter saw to Comet while Jane saw to Pearl, and they did this without discussion or ceremony in the natural way of people who have both been taking care of horses their whole lives. He built the fire because she had already begun unpacking what she needed from her carpetbag, and he had nothing that needed unpacking, and he was good at building fires quickly and efficiently. She produced a small cast iron pan and a paper-wrapped parcel of salt pork, and a handful of dried beans that she had apparently been soaking in water in a cloth-stoppered jar since morning, which struck him as a very organized and practical thing to have thought to do. "You have done this before," he said, not as a question. "Traveled alone." She crouched near the fire and laid strips of salt pork in the pan, where they began to spit and hiss immediately. "No, this is the first time." "You seem like you know what you are doing." She glanced at him sideways. "My father was a farmer in Missouri. We were not the kind of people who had others do things for us. What brought you to Wichita?" The question sat in the air for a moment. The pork was starting to smell very good. She turned it with a fork she had produced from somewhere in the carpetbag, and she took a small breath before she answered, the kind of breath that prepares a person to say something they have thought about saying and decided to say honestly. "Marriage," she said, "which is the thing that brings most women to places they did not choose. My husband was a man named Harold Ford. He ran a dry goods store on Douglas Avenue. He was a reasonable man when I married him and a different kind of man afterward." She paused. "I want to be clear that he never struck me. I want to say that because I think people always expect that is what drove a woman out, and they cannot conceive of other reasons. He did not need to strike me. He had other methods." Dexter watched the fire rather than watching her. He understood she was not telling him this to invite his commentary or his sympathy. She was telling him because it was the truth, and she had apparently decided he was someone she could be truthful with, and he was deeply aware of what a gift that was under the circumstances. "I am sorry," he said simply. "Do not be sorry," she said. "I am not. I left. That took me 3 years longer than it should have, but I did it. I packed one bag and I took Pearl, who was mine from before the marriage and who he never touched because he was afraid of horses, and I rode out of Wichita on a Tuesday morning when he had gone to the store. She plated the salt pork and divided the beans between 2 tin cups she produced from the bag. He will not come after me. He will not want the embarrassment of people knowing his wife left him." She handed him one of the tin cups. "Thank you," he said. "For the beans or for listening?" "Both." She looked at him again. That direct, green-eyed look that he was starting to understand was simply how she looked at things, straight on, without deflection. "Your turn," she said. "My turn. You know something about me now. It seems fair." He ate a spoonful of beans and thought about it. He was a private man by habit, not because he had anything particularly dark to hide, but because years of living outdoors with other men had taught him that conversation was currency, and you did not spend it carelessly. "I grew up in Missouri, too," he said, "near Joplin. My father died when I was 14, and my mother remarried a year later to a man who was not unkind, but who had 5 children of his own and no particular room for a sixth. I lit out when I was 16 and found work with a cattle outfit and have been doing it ever since." "Do you like it?" she asked. "The cattle work?" He considered this more honestly than he normally would have. "I like the riding," he said. "I like the open country. I like being good at something that matters and knowing I am good at it. The cattle themselves are not particularly interesting animals." He paused. "Sometimes I think I have been moving so long I have forgotten what it would feel like to stop somewhere." Something in her expression softened very slightly at that. "I know that feeling," she said, "though I came to it differently." They ate in comfortable quiet after that, listening to the fire and the creek and the night sounds of the prairie settling into itself. The sky above the cottonwoods was enormous and thick with stars, the Milky Way strung across it like spilled lamp smoke. Dexter had slept under that sky more nights than he could count, and he had never much thought about it, but tonight he looked up at it, and for the first time in a long while it seemed genuinely beautiful rather than just large. They arranged the watch without much discussion. He took the first watch. She took the second, and neither of them made any pointed remarks about the arrangement because they were both practical people and both understood that the Strip had real dangers that were not helped by sentiment. When he woke her at midnight to take her turn, she was already half awake, sitting up in her bedroll with her eyes open and the revolver close at hand. He realized that she likely slept like that all the time now, or had learned to. "All quiet," he told her, low, and settled into his own blankets while she moved to sit near the fire's embers with her back against a cottonwood and the revolver in her lap. He was asleep within minutes, which was a skill the trail had given him, but before sleep came, he lay looking at the stars and thought about a woman who had written a note asking only that someone know she existed, and he thought it was very strange and very specific and very fortunate that he had been the one to find it. He did not examine why he thought it was fortunate. He was not ready to examine that yet. They broke camp at first light, boiling water for coffee over a small fire and eating the last of her corn bread, which she had wrapped in a cloth and carried in a tin box that kept it reasonably fresh. She had, he noticed, thought ahead in a great many small ways. The soaking beans, the tin box, the fact that her carpetbag, which was not a large bag, appeared to contain exactly what was needed and nothing that was not. "You planned this carefully," he said, handing her back the tin coffee cup she had lent him. "I have been planning it for a year," she said. "When you are going to do something that frightens you, the best defense against the fear is to be very prepared." "Were you frightened?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Terrified," she said pleasantly. "I still am a little." "It is different from the fear of staying, though. Staying was a fear that got heavier every day. This kind is lighter." He nodded. He understood that distinction without needing it explained further. They rode out with the sun just clearing the horizon and painting the whole eastern sky in shades of orange and rose, the kind of sunrise that made even a man who had seen 1,000 of them pause and look. Jane paused too, her hand loosening on Pearl's reins for a moment, her face tipped slightly toward the light. "It is beautiful country," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "It is," he agreed. "Even when it is hard, it is beautiful." She turned and looked at him then, and he thought she was going to say something, but she just studied him for a moment with that direct look and then turned back to the trail. They crossed into the Cimarron Strip by mid-morning, a broad stretch of country that in 1873 existed in a kind of legal no-man's land. The land between Kansas and the Oklahoma Territory was not formally assigned to any state, and the law, such as it was, did not extend very reliably into its borders. It was home to outlaws and drifters, to cattle rustlers and land speculators who had not yet found a territory willing to claim them, and to a scattering of Cherokee and Osage people who had been pushed further and further from the lands they had occupied for generations by treaties that were made and broken with a regularity that would have been remarkable if it had not been so entirely expected. Dexter knew the strip from previous drives. He had not liked it much then, and he did not like it now. But he knew its geography reasonably well, and he knew the places to avoid, and the places that were relatively safe to pass through. "We should aim to cross the Cimarron River by mid-afternoon," he told her. "Once we are across and into the Oklahoma Territory proper, it is easier. The country is better watered and there are settlements with people who generally keep to themselves." "How far from the river to Red Creek?" she asked. "I do not know that country precisely. Do you have directions from your cousin?" She reached into the canvas coat and produced a folded letter, much handled by the look of it, the creases soft from repeated opening and folding. She read from it carefully. "She says to follow the Cimarron east once I am across, until I find a grove of pecan trees on the south bank. Then turn south and ride until I see a red limestone outcropping she calls the Rooster on account of its shape. The homestead is another mile south of that." Dexter thought about this. "Pecan trees on the south bank of the Cimarron. That should not be hard to find once we are across. Pecans are not common in this country." She refolded the letter with the same care she gave all her possessions and tucked it back into her coat. "My cousin Clara has been out here 4 years," she said. "She came with her husband, Thomas Wren. He died of fever the second winter. I am sorry." "She stayed," Jane said. "She had already broken the ground and built the cabin, and she stayed. She runs cattle, not many, and she grows a kitchen garden, and she has a milk cow and 3 chickens. She says in her letter that she is perfectly content." Something in the way she said this told him that Jane found that fact both impressive and comforting. The idea of a woman who had survived loss and chosen to stay in the place she had built rather than retreating to something safer and smaller. "She sounds like a strong woman," he said. "She is the strongest person I know," Jane said. "She is why I thought this was possible. If Clara Wren could do what she did, I had no right to stay in a life that was making me less and less of myself." Dexter was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "For what it is worth, Miss Ford, from what I can tell, there is a great deal of you left." She looked at him, startled out of whatever she had been thinking, and then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, quick and unguarded, and it changed her whole face, the careful wariness of it dropping away for a moment to show something underneath that was warm and real and entirely undefended. It was only a moment, but it was the kind of moment that a man does not forget. "Thank you, Dexter," she said, and that was the first time she had used his name. They came to the Cimarron River around 2 in the afternoon. The river was running low after the dry autumn, which was good for crossing but less good in general terms, as a low river meant the banks on either side were muddy and uncertain, and the crossing itself would be messy. He went first on Comet to test the bottom and found it firm enough, though the mud pulled at the horse's hooves, and the water ran cold and surprisingly swift through the shallower crossing point he had found. He came back to the north bank, and she had already pushed Pearl into the water before he could say anything about waiting. The gray mare went through without hesitating, trusting her rider, and Jane kept her seat easily and crossed with her carpetbag held up slightly from the saddle to keep it clear of the water. She reached the south bank a few feet below where he had crossed, Pearl scrambling up through the mud with purpose, and Jane was grinning when she reached solid ground. "She is a good horse," Dexter said. "She is the best horse," Jane said, leaning forward to pat Pearl's neck. "We have had an understanding since she was a foal." The Oklahoma Territory spread out before them, and it was indeed different in character from the Kansas side. The grass here was a different color, darker and more various, with stands of actual trees in the creek bottoms and low rolling hills that gave the land a sense of shape it had lacked on the open prairie. The light was different too, filtered through more clouds to the south, and the air carried a faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere far off. "Someone is settled nearby," Jane said, smelling it too. "There are Cherokee farms through this country," he said. He paused, because he wanted to say this next part carefully and honestly. The Cherokee were removed from their lands east of the Mississippi by the government in 1838, the march they call the Trail of Tears. A great many of them died on that journey. Those who survived were resettled in Indian Territory, and many of them rebuilt their lives here with remarkable determination, built farms and schools, and printed their own newspaper. The government has not stopped making agreements it does not intend to keep, but for now this is their territory by treaty, and they have the right to it. Jane was listening to him with the kind of attention that told him she had not known this in detail and was taking it seriously. "Then we are riding through someone else's rightful land," she said. "We are passing through on a public road," he said. "It is not the same as settling. But yes, it is worth knowing what the ground beneath you represents." She nodded slowly. "My father used to say that the first thing a man does to take something from you is convince you it was never really yours to begin with. Your father was a wise man. He was a tired man," she said. "But yes." They found the pecan trees near sunset, a small grove of them, the only ones along that stretch of the river's south bank, their branches still holding a few late leaves. Jane's face lit up when she spotted them, a sudden bright relief that she did not try to hide. "There," she said, "I see them." They made camp under the pecan trees that night, and the camp felt different from the one in the draw, easier and warmer in some way that was not only about the weather. They talked for a long time after supper, not about anything particularly weighty. He told her about a memorable cattle drive where 300 longhorns had stampeded into a creek at midnight during a lightning storm, and every single one of them had swum out the other side without a man lost, and barely a cow unaccounted for. She told him about learning to ride properly on a mule because her family could not afford a horse until she was 12, and how by the time they got the horse she could ride anything with 4 legs, because a mule does not tolerate a poor rider for even one moment. She laughed again when she told that story, and this time the laugh lasted longer and she did not pull it back. He laughed too, and the sound of it surprised him a little, the ease of it, because he was not generally a man who laughed freely. "You have a very serious face," she told him at one point, tilting her head to study him in the firelight. "But you are not actually a very serious person, or not only that. What am I then?" He asked. "I have not decided yet," she said. "I will let you know when I have." He lay in his blankets that night and stared up through the pecan branches at the stars, and he thought that he had spent 10 years riding across some of the most beautiful and unforgiving country in the world, and had never once had someone look at him the way Jane Ford looked at him, and pronounce that she was still in the process of deciding what he was. He found, to his own considerable surprise, that he wanted very much to know what she would decide. In the morning, they found the red limestone outcropping called the Rooster. It was exactly what Clara Wren's letter had described, a tall column of red rock shaped at its top like a cockerel's comb, visible from quite a distance. The sight of it made Jane straighten in her saddle. "1 more mile," she said. "1 more mile," he confirmed. They rode it in a silence that felt solemn, or perhaps ceremonial, the end of a journey that had begun in a different life. The prairie here had been partly broken by a plow, long strips of turned earth alternating with the native grass, the sign of a working homestead. Then they came over a small rise and saw it below them, a square cabin built from the reddish limestone common to this country, with a covered porch and a small barn to one side, and a kitchen garden behind a low post fence. There was a cow in a small pen, and laundry on a rope line between 2 posts, and smoke coming from the chimney in a thin, cheerful column. A woman came out of the cabin door and stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the morning light. She was perhaps 30, solidly built, with sandy hair pulled back under a cloth bonnet. She stood very still for just a moment, and then she came down off the porch steps at a pace that became a run. Jane was already off Pearl before Dexter had properly registered she was moving. She went off the horse in a single smooth motion and ran to meet the woman coming across the yard, and they met each other halfway and held on for a long time, both of them talking at once in low, intense voices that he could not hear from where he sat on Comet, but he could see Jane's shoulders shaking and Clara's arms tight around her, and he looked away and gave them the moment entirely. Clara Wren was a woman who had, as promised, survived a great deal and become very practical about life as a result. She fed them both within 20 minutes of their arrival, a proper breakfast of eggs from her 3 chickens and cornmeal mush, and a pot of strong tea, and she asked direct questions and accepted direct answers, and did not waste time on anything that was not useful. She had the same quality of attention that Jane had, that direct green-eyed intelligence, and Dexter could see where Jane had modeled some of her own manner, because Clara was the stronger version of it, the one that had been through fire and come out hardened rather than burned. She also looked at Dexter with a measuring eye that was entirely unsentimental. "You found Jane by chance," she said over the breakfast table while Jane was washing her face and hands at the basin in the corner. "I found a note she had left in a Bible at a trading post," he said, "and I followed her." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "She wrote that she wanted someone to know she existed," he said. "I could not read that and do nothing." Clara was quiet. Then she said very evenly, "You are either a very good man or you are very good at seeming like one." "I am aware of the distinction," he said. "I have no argument against caution." She studied him a moment longer and then nodded once as though she had made a decision. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "It is clean. There is a good blanket on the peg by the door." It was not an invitation to stay indefinitely, but it was not an order to leave either, and he understood the difference. He stayed 3 days. Those 3 days were the kind that a person does not realize they are living fully until some time afterward, when the memory of them has the quality of something preserved rather than something that simply passed. He repaired Clara's fence posts, 2 of which had rotted and needed replacing. He mended a section of roof on the barn where rain had been getting in. He rode out with Clara one afternoon to check on her small herd of cattle, and she showed him the land she had been working for 4 years, and told him her plans for it in a matter-of-fact tone that made it clear she was not asking for his opinion, just sharing information. Jane spent those 3 days doing the things that a woman who has been held too tight for 3 years does when she is finally in a place that is safe. She slept late the first morning, something that Dexter suspected had not been permitted to her in a long time. She helped Clara in the garden and laughed easily and often. She read a book that Clara kept on the small shelf by the window, a novel that she would sometimes look up from with an expression of pure unguarded pleasure before going back to the page. She braided her hair differently, looser, and left some of it down, and the effect of this, combined with the prairie sunlight on her face and the ease that had come into her shoulders, was considerable. He noticed all of it. He was aware that he was noticing all of it, and that this was new information about himself. On the 3rd afternoon, they walked out to the edge of the broken ground together, following the line where Clara's plowing stopped and the native grass began, and the prairie light was going gold and long around them. They had not arranged to walk out together particularly. He had been coming back from checking on the fence line, and she had been coming back from the garden, and their paths had simply converged at the edge of the yard and continued. "What will you do now?" she asked him. "You said you were not hired again until spring." "I was not," he said. "I have money enough to manage for a while. And then another cattle drive." He was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the grass with a sound like a long exhale. He had been thinking about this, had been thinking about it more than he usually allowed himself to think about the future, which was normally not a subject he found productive to dwell on. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about the possibility that there is another kind of life a man might build if he had a reason to build it somewhere." She was looking at the horizon. He was aware that she heard what he meant beneath what he said, because she was very intelligent and she was paying very close attention to him as she always paid close attention to things. "That is a large thought," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Larger than I am generally comfortable with." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am not ready to think about anything that large yet. I have only just gotten here. I have only just started being whoever it is I am going to be from now on." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to think about anything. I am only telling you what I have been thinking because you asked." She turned and looked at him then, and the look had the directness it always had, but it also had something else in it now, something open and careful and not at all certain, which was the most honest thing any look had ever communicated to him. "I am glad you found the note," she said. "I am glad it was you." He held her gaze. "So am I," he said. They stood in the long prairie light for a moment that had no particular need to be anything other than what it was, and then they turned and walked back toward the cabin together, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed in the way that might have been entirely accidental and was not. He left the next morning. He had not planned to leave quite that soon, but he understood that staying longer without a clear purpose would not be honest to the situation, and he was committed to being honest, especially about this. He said goodbye to Clara first in the barn while he was saddling Comet, and she shook his hand with a firm grip and told him that he was welcome to come back, which from Clara was a significant thing to say. Jane walked out to the road with him. Pearl followed at her shoulder because Pearl went where Jane went. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I was thinking about Caldwell," he said. "There is winter work at some of the ranches near there. I know the country." "That is a long way from here," she said. "Yes," he said. She stroked Pearl's nose. The horse leaned into her hand. Dexter finished checking Comet's cinch for the second time, which he had already checked once perfectly well. "Dexter," she said. He looked at her. "The note I wrote," she said. "I wrote it because I was very afraid and very alone, and I needed to put that somewhere outside of myself. I did not write it expecting anyone to come after me." "I know," he said. "But I think," she said slowly, working through the words with the same careful precision she applied to everything, "that the fact that you did has changed something for me. About what I believe is possible. I want you to know that." He held Comet's reins loosely. The horse stood patient and still. "What do you believe is possible?" he asked quietly. She met his eyes with a clarity that did not waver. "I believe it is possible that a person can find their way to somewhere real," she said. "I believe it is possible that the finding does not have to be entirely alone." He thought about all the things he might say to that. He thought about the note in his shirt pocket, which he still had, which he had not returned to her, and which she had not asked for. He thought about 10 years of riding toward nothing in particular and the strange brightness of the last 4 days. "I will be back in the spring," he said. "If that is all right." She looked at him for a long moment. "It is all right," she said. He swung up into the saddle. He looked down at her standing in the road with Pearl at her shoulder, and the prairie spread behind her and the red limestone cabin with its thin thread of smoke, and he thought she was the most complete and real person he had ever encountered, and that the word beautiful was inadequate for what she was, but it was also perfectly accurate. "Take care of yourself, Jane Ford," he said. "I know how to do that," she said. "I have been learning." He touched the brim of his hat and turned Comet north, and he did not look back, because he knew if he looked back he would not leave, and leaving was the right thing to do right now. He rode north with the wind and the sun and the long gold prairie all around him, and the note in his pocket, and something new and warm and entirely unfamiliar settled in the center of his chest like an ember that had no intention of going out. The winter was long. He found work near Caldwell, as he had planned, helping a rancher named Bert Kellerman manage his herd through the hard months. It was good work and straightforward, the kind of work that kept his hands occupied and his body tired enough to sleep at night. His mind was considerably less cooperative. He wrote Jane 3 letters that winter. He was not a practiced letter writer, and this presented him with a certain difficulty, because he had things he wanted to say, and was uncertain how to say them on paper with the right balance of honesty and restraint. He drafted the first letter 4 times before he was satisfied with it, and it still struck him as inadequate when he mailed it. He told her about the work in the country around Caldwell and a memorable encounter with a stray longhorn who had somehow ended up in Kellerman's barn eating from the grain supply, and who required 4 men and considerable creative effort to relocate. He asked after Clara and after Pearl and after the chickens. He said he thought about his conversations with her often. Her first letter back came 6 weeks after he sent his. He read it twice in the bunkhouse and then took it outside and read it again in the cold winter light, which he needed because the words required more than 2 readings to properly absorb. She wrote well, better than he did, with that same directness she brought to everything, and without self-consciousness. She described the territory winter, which was hard but survivable and beautiful in a stark way she found herself unexpectedly loving. She described helping Clara birth a calf in the middle of the night and the subsequent feeling of having been useful in a way that was immediate and real. She said she had been helping Clara with the bookkeeping for the ranch, which she was good at, having done the accounts for Harold's store for 3 years, though she said the pleasure of doing it for Clara was entirely different because the work was hers now in a way it had not been before. She said she was sleeping well. She said that was not a small thing. At the end of the letter she wrote, "I find that I think about our conversations on the trail with an appreciation that seems to grow rather than diminish with time. I was not expecting to find that kind of company. I am glad I was wrong about what to expect." He read that last paragraph again in the winter sunlight and then folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the note. By the time he went back inside, he had begun composing his response in his head. 2 more letters passed between them before the weather began to turn. Her letters grew longer and his grew easier to write, the stiffness of unpracticed letter-writing loosening as the months passed, and he found the rhythm of saying things honestly on paper. She told him stories about the territory and the people she was meeting, Cherokee families who traded with Clara and who were, as she wrote it, some of the most dignified and self-possessed people she had ever encountered, and whose relationship with their land had a depth and history that made her feel both very new and very grateful to be allowed to exist anywhere near the edge of it. He told her about Kellerman's ranch and the other hands he worked with, and a long, quiet thought he had had one February night watching the stars about what a man's life ought to amount to. She wrote back about that last thing at some length. She said she had been thinking about the same question, and that she had come to believe that what a life ought to amount to was the quality of presence a person brought to the people and the places they found themselves near, rather than any measurable accumulation of things. Then she added in the same paragraph that she was also of the opinion that a person needed at minimum 1 good horse, a dry roof, and enough food to get through the winter, and that any philosophy that did not account for practical necessities was a philosophy built on sand. He read that paragraph and laughed out loud in the empty bunkhouse, alone at the table with her letter, and the sound of his own laughter was good company. He rode south in the first week of April, when the snow had cleared from the trail, and the grass was just beginning to show green at the roots. The spring air was clear and cold in the mornings and warm by midday, and the whole country was waking up with a thoroughness that he had always found moving after the shut-down months of winter. He rode Comet through the Cimarron at the same crossing they had used in the autumn, the river running higher now with snowmelt, the crossing deeper and wetter than before. Comet went through without complaint, which was one of the many things Dexter appreciated about that horse. He found the pecan trees on the south bank, showing their first soft leaves, and turned south, and he found the rooster standing in the morning light the same way it had been in September, red and peculiar and unmistakable. He came over the rise above Clara's homestead and stopped for a moment on the ridge, looking down at the cabin with its smoke and its garden, where someone was working among the early plantings. Pearl was in the small pasture beside the barn, her gray coat bright in the morning light. Even from this distance he could tell from the way she moved her head that she had caught Comet's scent on the wind. Horses remembered what mattered. The figure in the garden straightened and looked up and raised one hand, and it was a wave, not a wave of greeting exactly, but the kind of wave that a person gives when they have been watching for something and it has arrived. He rode down. Jane met him at the fence line, which is where she was when he reached it, having walked from the garden with her gloves in her hand. She was wearing a new dress, not new in the sense of just purchased, but new in the sense of being her own choice, a warm brown color that suited the prairie spring perfectly, and her hair was down in the way she had started wearing it at Clara's in the first days, loose and easy. She looked healthy. She looked like herself, which he was beginning to understand was a more specific and precise thing than it sounded. He swung down from Comet and they stood on either side of the fence for a moment, looking at each other the way people do when they have been exchanging letters for months and are now recalibrating the three-dimensional reality of a person against the version that exists in written words. "You look well," she said. "So do you," he said. "Better even than in the fall." "I feel better," she said. "I feel like myself, which I had not felt in a long time." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced the note, the original one, slightly worn at the folds from months of being carried, but intact. He held it out to her across the fence. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "You kept it," she said. "I did. All winter. I never intended to keep it," he said. "I kept meaning to give it back, and then I did not, and then it had been long enough that I thought I should keep it. I do not have a better explanation than that." She took the note from him gently and opened it and read it, which struck him as a quietly brave thing to read the words you wrote from the bottom of your fear when you were no longer afraid in the same way. She read it and folded it again and held it for a moment. "I am glad someone knows I exist," she said finally. "I am glad I am the someone," he said. She opened the fence gate, which she had to unlatch from her side, and he led Comet through, and she refastened the latch and they walked toward the barn together. He stayed, not in the way of a man who imposes himself on a situation, but in the way of a man who is useful and knows it and finds the right size of things. He helped Clara with the spring plowing, and his good eye for cattle was an asset when Clara wanted to expand her small herd with careful selection from the stock that moved through the territory. He built a lean-to addition on the south side of the barn that gave them more covered storage for the winter feed. He fixed the well casing, which had been giving Clara trouble for months. He and Jane walked the prairie every evening that spring after supper, when the light was at its most generous and the land was most fully itself. They talked about everything, about childhood and fear and hope, and the nature of belonging, about the land and the people on it and the complicated history of all of it, about books and horses, and the particular quality of silence that comes over the prairie just before a summer storm. They talked and they were quiet and both were equally comfortable, and this, Dexter thought, was the deepest kind of compatibility, the kind that does not require entertainment or noise to remain intact. One evening in late May, sitting on the low limestone wall at the edge of Clara's kitchen garden with the last of the sun laying orange and pink across the whole western sky, Jane said without preamble, "I am not frightened any more." "Of what specifically?" he asked, though he thought he knew. "Of this," she said, gesturing between them with a looseness of hand that included everything they had been building in the slow, deliberate way of people who had both been hurt in some way by carelessness. "Of whatever this is becoming. I was for a long time. I want you to know I was because I think you deserve to know the true state of things rather than only the arrived-at conclusion." He was very still. The sky was doing extraordinary things behind her. "Thank you for telling me that," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and the green of her eyes in that light was a color he did not have a name for. "Dexter," she said. "Yes. I think I love you," she said. "I did not intend to. But I have been careful about what I feel and what I call things, because I know the difference between gratitude and love, and I know the difference between relief and love, and I have been making very certain of what this is before I said anything about it. And I believe it is love." He thought about 10 years of moving and the note in the Bible and the autumn prairie and the letters and the spring light and every moment of the last 8 months, and he thought that he had known what this was for some time but had been waiting for her, because she needed to arrive at it in her own time, and he had been willing to wait for as long as it took. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since somewhere around the first evening in the draw when you divided the beans into 2 equal portions without making any remark about it, and I am aware that sounds like an absurd thing to mark a moment by." She laughed, that full, unguarded laugh that was one of his favorite sounds in the world. "The beans," she said. "The beans," he confirmed. "And everything after." She leaned forward and kissed him, which she did with the same directness she brought to everything, and it was warm and real and felt like an arrival rather than a beginning, which was the right way to feel about something that had been building this long. He asked her to marry him 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in June, standing in Clara's kitchen garden with his hat in his hands and the early summer air soft around them. He asked her carefully and honestly, not as a thing a man does because it is time or because it is expected, but because he could not imagine building the life he wanted without her in the exact center of it. She said yes with a directness that had no hesitation in it. Clara, who had been visibly waiting for this development since approximately April, was moved to a brief practical expression of emotion that involved pressing both hands against her face for a moment before she recovered herself, and announced that they would need to ride to the county seat at Guthrie to file the proper paperwork, and that she would look after Pearl and the cattle while they were gone, and that they ought to plan to go before the summer heat made the ride uncomfortable. They were married in Guthrie in July of 1874, in the office of the county clerk, with Clara as witness, and a bemused court officer named Henderson officiating in his shirt sleeves, because it was very warm. Jane wore her brown dress, which was the best she had, and Dexter wore his cleanest shirt and his good vest, and had managed to get a proper shave from the barber in town that morning. The ceremony was not long. The words that mattered were said. Jane looked at him when they were said with a clarity of expression that had no shadow of anything in it but certainty. Afterward they sat on the boardwalk outside a cafe and ate pie, which was good pie, and Clara made a short toast with her coffee cup that was characteristically practical and also very warm, and said that she was glad Jane had forgotten the Bible at that trading post. "I did not forget it," Jane said, with a sidelong look at Dexter. "I left it on purpose." Both Dexter and Clara looked at her. "The note," Dexter said. "I wrote it in Caldwell," she said, with a composure that suggested she had been holding this piece of information for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to produce it. "I had been sitting in the trading post waiting for my horse's shoe to be reset, and I had that Bible in my hands, and I had been carrying all that fear and aloneness for so long, and I thought, what if I wrote it down and left it somewhere just to let it go? The way you release a bird." She paused. "I did not leave the Bible accidentally. I set it on the counter on purpose because I thought if someone found the note they might do something kind with it or they might do nothing, but either way the writing of it would have released some of the weight of it." Dexter looked at her. "You wanted someone to find it," he said. "I wanted to release the fear," she said. "Whether anyone found it was not something I thought about very specifically." She met his eyes. "I am very glad it was you." He thought about the note in his shirt pocket on that day in October, falling from between the Bible's pages. He thought about standing in Halston's trading post and reading those words, the particular quality of the moment, the way it had felt like something that was happening rather than something he was merely observing. "I was going to leave," he said. "I had paid for my coffee and my gloves. I was going to walk out the door." "But you did not," she said. "But I did not," he agreed. Clara was watching both of them with an expression of quiet satisfaction that she was not bothering to conceal. "The Lord works through Bible passages and dropped notes, apparently," she said, and drank her coffee. They rode back to the homestead that evening, the three of them in the long summer dusk, and the Oklahoma Territory lay around them in every direction, wide and various and alive with the sounds of summer. Jane rode Pearl and Dexter rode Comet and Clara rode her own horse, a solid dun named Molasses, and they talked and were quiet in equal measure, and the road home was easy. In the months that followed, Dexter and Jane built their own cabin. Not far from Clara's, close enough that they were neighbors in the truest sense, close enough to help each other and share the labor of the land, but separate in the way that two households need to be. The cabin went up through August and September, Dexter doing the heavy framing and stonework with help from two Cherokee men who lived a few miles to the east, brothers named Samuel and Joseph Sixkiller, whose family had been settled in the territory for nearly 30 years, and who knew this land with a depth and specificity that Dexter listened to with attention and respect. Samuel Sixkiller taught him which soil held water and which did not, where the underground springs were, and how to read the sky for the kind of weather that came fast in this country and hit hard. Joseph helped with the stonework and showed him the most efficient way to cut and lay the red limestone so it would stand against the wind, and told him about the year the great tornado had come through and which structures had held and which had not, and why. Dexter paid them fairly for their labor and their knowledge, and the four of them sat on the half-finished porch one September evening and shared a meal that Jane had cooked over the fire outside, and the conversation moved between English and the Cherokee words that Samuel and Joseph offered occasionally, and that Jane wrote down carefully in a small notebook, because she had decided she was going to learn as much as she could, which was the kind of thing she did. The cabin was finished in late September, 1 year almost to the day after Dexter had first ridden south following a woman on a gray horse. It was a solid cabin, well built and properly chinked against the winter, with 2 rooms and a good fireplace and a porch that faced the sunset because Jane had said she wanted to see the sunsets properly. The evening they first slept in it, Jane stood on the porch for a long time in the early dark, her coffee cup in both hands, looking out at the prairie. He stood beside her. The sky was doing the thing it sometimes did out here in the evenings, turning every color from rose to violet to a deep blue that seemed to go back forever, and the first stars were appearing in the east. "This is mine," she said quietly. It was not a possessive declaration. It was something more tender than that, the voice of a person naming something they had been afraid to claim. "Ours," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her, and they stood together on their porch in the October dark, listening to the night. Winter came to the Oklahoma Territory with a severity that reminded everyone that the land was beautiful but not gentle, not at its core. January brought 3 weeks of cold that had the horses blowing frost in the barn, and the firewood going faster than he had calculated, which meant 2 cold and arduous wood-cutting expeditions that he and Jane tackled together, her handling the draft horse they had acquired in November while he split, because she was, as it turned out, an excellent hand with a draft horse and not particularly interested in the splitting. Clara came for supper twice a week through the winter, and they always talked late into the evening. Clara had begun corresponding with a cattle buyer in Guthrie named Amos Patterson, a widower in his mid-30s with a straightforward character and a good business, and the correspondence had a quality to it that made Jane smile every time Clara mentioned it with studied casualness. "Amos says the cattle prices are expected to rise in the spring," Clara said one February evening, entirely without inflection. "Does he write often?" Jane asked, in exactly the same tone. Clara applied herself to her coffee. In February of 1875, Jane told Dexter she was expecting a child. She told him quietly, one morning before the sun was fully up, sitting across the kitchen table from him with her coffee, the way she had always told him important things, directly and without ceremony, because she believed important things deserved to be said plainly rather than dressed up in a way that might obscure them. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something hit the interior of him hard enough to require a moment before he could respond with anything that was true. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "I feel entirely fine. I have been watching for the signs for a while to be certain before I said anything." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the early morning quiet with the fire going and the cold outside and the first gray light coming through the east window. "I am so glad," he said, and his voice had something in it that she had heard from him only rarely, the sound of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for. She squeezed his hand. "So am I," she said. They wrote to Dexter's mother in Missouri, who wrote back a long letter that was full of practical advice and obvious happiness, and which arrived in April just as the weather was turning warm again. She had remarried the widower she had been living beside for years, and she was well, and she said she had always believed her Dexter would find his way to something real. She had just wondered what had taken him so long. Jane read this letter and smiled and said she thought she would like Dexter's mother a great deal. The spring and summer were full. There was land to plow and plant, a small crop of corn and a kitchen garden that Jane expanded considerably from Clara's model, adding more variety, growing tomatoes and squash and beans, and a small herb garden that she tended with particular attention. The horses needed regular work. The cattle, which they now had a small herd of 12 head, required daily attention and occasional veterinary judgment that Dexter had to make from practical experience rather than formal training. Samuel Sixkiller helped them with a difficult fence repair in May and stayed for lunch, and his wife Rachel came with him, and she and Jane sat together on the porch afterward, talking quietly, while the men looked at the new calf that had been born the week before and was showing signs of excellent conformation. Rachel Sixkiller was a woman of great warmth and practical wisdom, and she and Jane formed a friendship that became, over the coming years, one of the most important of Jane's life. Rachel knew this land and its plants and its animals with an intimacy that came from generations of people knowing it, and she was generous with that knowledge in a way that Jane received with gratitude, and without the kind of careless assumption that some newcomers brought to such exchanges. Amos Patterson came to call on Clara for the first time in June, riding down from Guthrie on a large bay horse with a careful manner and good manners. He was a decent-looking man of 34, steady and quiet, with the kind of face that got better the more you saw it because it was honest rather than simply pleasant. Clara received him with a composure that would have impressed anyone who did not know her, and the four of them sat on Clara's porch that evening after supper, Jane and Dexter and Clara and Amos, and talked until the stars were well established and the night birds had started. Dexter liked Amos Patterson immediately and without reservation, which was not something that usually happened to him quickly. The man was exactly what he appeared to be, which in Dexter's experience was rarer than it ought to be. Clara married Amos Patterson in September of 1875, a few months after Dexter and Jane's first child, a boy named William Thomas Mercer, came into the world on a hot August night with Rachel Sixkiller present as midwife and Clara sitting outside the cabin door through the whole of it, which was hours, and which she spent in a state of prayer that she was later slightly embarrassed to admit had been entirely sincere. William Thomas Mercer arrived loudly and with an apparently robust opinion about the situation, which made everyone in the cabin laugh with relief. He was a large, healthy baby with dark eyes like his father and a quality of immediate physical presence that seemed implausible in someone who had only been in the world for a few minutes. Jane held him and looked at him with an expression that Dexter could not have described in any language available to him, but which he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they both looked at their son, who had by now quieted somewhat and was examining the ceiling of the cabin with his enormous dark eyes as though assessing its structural integrity. "William," Jane said softly, trying the name. "William," he agreed. "He has your jaw," she said. "He has your expression," he said. "That exact look of evaluating whether everything meets his standards." She laughed quietly, tired and warm and entirely happy. Clara's marriage to Amos Patterson changed the shape of things in a comfortable way. Amos brought resources and connections that helped both homesteads become more stable, and Clara, who had been managing alone for so long, settled into a partnership that suited her extremely well, because Amos was the kind of man who had no interest in diminishing a competent woman. They worked the two properties together, and their combined operation became, over the next few years, a moderately successful cattle ranch by the standards of the territory. Dexter and Jane's life took its shape slowly and well. He had stopped thinking about cattle drives. The spring that he had always told himself he would return to the trail for kept coming and going and finding him at home, which was where he discovered he wanted to be. He was good at what he was building here. He could read cattle and land and weather as well as any man in the territory, and he learned from Samuel and Joseph Sixkiller everything they were willing to teach him about this specific piece of country, and he was grateful for every bit of it. In the spring of 1877, Jane told him again across the kitchen table in the same early morning way that they were expecting another child. William, by now a solid and determined 1-year-old who walked everywhere with a forward lean that suggested he was always just slightly more committed to speed than his legs could quite manage, was making noise in the other room where he had been put down to play. Dexter looked at Jane in the morning light. She was 27 years old, and she was the most beautiful and real thing in his life, and sitting across the table from her with coffee and the sounds of their son exploring the next room and the prairie morning starting outside the window was not a circumstance he would have been able to imagine from the back of a horse in the autumn of 1873, but it was the most correct circumstance he had ever existed in. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "William was not easy, and I survived him admirably." "You did," he said. "You are extraordinary." "I know," she said simply, with the kind of certainty that had taken her years to arrive at and that she wore now as naturally as her own skin. Their second child, a girl they named Clara Jane Mercer, was born in October of 1877, in the autumn that was beginning to feel like the natural season of their family, the autumn that had started everything. She came into the world considerably more peacefully than her brother had, as though she had made a decision about the manner of her arrival. She had Jane's eyes, the clear green of them, and Dexter's broad build around the shoulders, and a quality of watchful attention from her first hours that both parents recognized immediately, and that made them smile at each other over her head. William, at 17 months, was brought in to see his sister and stood beside the bed with a gravity that was entirely his own, and then reached out one careful hand and touched her cheek with one finger gently, and said something in his developing language that none of them could parse precisely, but that had the quality of a solemn greeting. "He is welcoming her," Jane said. "He is," Dexter agreed. He looked at his family, his wife and his son and his daughter in the October light, and the cabin that was theirs, and the land outside that they had learned and were still learning, and the neighbors who had become the closest thing to family either of them had built for themselves, and he thought about a note in a Bible and a November morning in a trading post and the long ride south, and how it was not possible to trace a straight line from that moment to this one, without passing through every single thing that had happened between, every letter and conversation and difficult winter day and joyful spring morning, and how every single thing that had happened between had been necessary. The years settled into themselves with the particular richness of a life that has found its true form. William grew into a boy who was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, who followed his father around the ranch with an absorption that gradually became real knowledge, and who also followed his mother around the kitchen garden, and sat beside her when she read and showed every sign of having her quality of direct attention paired with his father's physical confidence, which seemed like a fortunate combination. Clara Jane grew into a girl who was quieter than her brother and perhaps deeper in some way, who spent long stretches of time in the garden with her mother and longer stretches still with Rachel Sixkiller learning the names of plants and their properties, who drew pictures of everything she saw in a notebook Jane gave her, and who asked questions of the careful, fundamental kind that suggested she would not rest until she had the true answer rather than the convenient one. By 1880, the Mercer homestead was a working ranch of respectable size, with 35 head of cattle and a proper barn, and a second structure that served as a combination storage building and workroom. The cabin had been expanded, an additional room added for the children, with a new stone fireplace that Dexter and Samuel Sixkiller built together over a week in the summer, and which was the finest thing Dexter had ever helped construct. Jane kept her accounts in careful ledgers and ran the household with the same organized precision she had always had, but loosened now from the tension that had once made it necessary. She was on the board of a small school that had been established for the children of the surrounding homesteads, white and Cherokee children both, which had required a certain amount of political navigation that Jane had approached with characteristic directness and practical effectiveness. She had also become the person that the women in the area came to with problems they did not know how to solve, because she had the combination of practical intelligence and emotional honesty that made her genuinely useful. Dexter watched all of this with a pride that was not the owning kind but the witnessing kind, the pride of a man who recognizes the full dimensions of who his partner is and considers himself fortunate to be close enough to see them. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, in July of 1880, they sat on the porch in the long summer dusk, the children put to bed inside, and the prairie spread before them in all its varieties of gold and green, and the enormous sky going through its evening colors. Clara and Amos had come for supper, and left an hour ago, and the night had reached the particular comfortable silence of after good company. Jane had her feet up on the porch rail and her coffee in her hand, and she was looking at the horizon in the way she had always looked at it, with attention and pleasure and without needing it to be different from what it was. "Dexter," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you something." "All right." She looked at him sideways with the green eyes that still, after everything, had the power to be the most specific thing in his field of vision. "I have been thinking about the note," she said. He smiled a little. "The note comes up fairly regularly." "It does," she agreed, "because it is the beginning of everything and beginnings matter." She paused. "I wrote it because I was afraid and alone, and I wanted to release the weight of that by giving it somewhere to land. That is what I told you before." "It is. But I have been thinking," she said, "that there was something else in it too. Something I perhaps did not know I was doing at the time. I think I was also writing it to the universe, or to God, or to whatever it is that listens to the things we say when we are very honest about what we need. And what I needed, Dexter, was exactly this. Not a rescue, not a protector, not someone to carry me somewhere, just someone who would find me and say, 'I see you,' and mean it, and then keep meaning it." He was quiet for a moment because she deserved a real response and not a quick one. "I have meant it from the first moment," he said, "and I intend to go on meaning it." She leaned toward him and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against the side of his neck, the way she had on the first evening they had spent in this cabin, and they sat together on the porch in the summer dark with the prairie all around them, and the stars coming out one by one above the cottonwoods along the creek, and the sound of 2 children breathing in peaceful sleep through the open window, and the sound of their horses in the pasture, Comet and Pearl, who were both getting on in years but were still good and solid and deeply familiar. The note was tucked in the back of Jane's Bible now, her own Bible, a new one she had acquired in Guthrie. She had put it there herself carefully, the way you keep something that represents the hinge point of your life, the moment before and the moment after. Dexter had given it back to her on their wedding day, produced it from his vest pocket at the end of the ceremony, and she had taken it with a look on her face that had been one of the most complex and complete expressions he had ever seen, recognition and tenderness and the particular warmth of a person who understands that they have been held carefully. She kept it. He was glad she kept it. The night deepened around them. Somewhere out on the prairie a coyote called and was answered by another, the sound carrying far and clear in the cool air. Comet raised his head in the pasture, a dark shape against the paler grass, and then lowered it again, satisfied. "What are you thinking?" Jane asked him softly in the dark. He thought about a trading post and a November morning, and a piece of paper falling from between the pages of a Bible, and the note unfolding in his hands as though it had been waiting for him, and a woman on a gray horse on the long prairie, and everything that had come from the particular grace of that encounter. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in the Oklahoma Territory." She smiled against his shoulder. "You are," she agreed, "and I am the luckiest woman." "I thought you did not believe in luck," he said. "I thought you believed in preparation." "I believe in both," she said. "Preparation gets you to the place where luck can find you. I prepared myself to leave, and luck sent me a cowboy who could not walk past a dropped piece of paper." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she settled more fully against him, and the prairie night went on around them in all its wide and star-filled indifference, and they were warm at the center of it, warm and settled and entirely home. Inside the cabin, William Thomas Mercer stirred in his sleep and said something quiet and unintelligible that was probably a dream. Clara Jane breathed steadily beside him, deep in whatever interior world children inhabit at that age, full of the day's small discoveries. Pearl stood patient in the pasture. Comet swished his tail at something in the dark. The cottonwoods along the creek moved in the night wind with a sound like the turning of very old and very good pages. And Jane Ford Mercer, who had once written a note asking only that someone know she existed, sat on her porch on her land with her husband's arm around her, and the whole abundant life that she had built around her on every side. And she knew, without a shadow of any doubt, that she was known. Fully known and deeply loved, which is all that anyone, in any era of any wild and beautiful and difficult world, has ever truly needed to be.